Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Mom Strength. This is your host, Surabhi Veech, and I'm really excited to have on Divya Kumar today. She is a perinatal mental health therapist. So let me do her official bio, and then we're going to welcome her on. So Divya Kumar is a South Asian American psychotherapist with a public health background who specializes in perinatal mental health, trauma, and the life transitions related to pregnancy, childbirth, and parenting. She's especially passionate about holding space for folks of color and folks who identify as first and second generation immigrants as they navigate the transition to parenthood and explore how racial identity, and culture intersect with parenting. Hi, Divya. I'm so excited to have you on here today.
It's so great to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
As I just connect with you, read more about you, I'm just like, this is who someone like me needs as an immigrant myself, raising biracial kids, trying to figure it all out, culture, race, parenting, often without the best. I don't want to say the best, but often without the examples that maybe we needed because our parents were raised in a different time, different generation, different culture. So why don't you tell me a little bit about your work in mental health?
Sure. Yes. And that story resonates with me, right? That's kind of my story and how I sort of tumbled into this work. So, yeah, I grew up in Connecticut. My parents are immigrants from India. My dad came in 1965. My mom came in 1971. Um, child of Indian immigrants in white suburban Connecticut, super preppy, super like white suburban jock, like this 80s, right? So like collars and like Mercedes and everything. Um, it was I was just so other all the time, experienced so much racial trauma, and just took such a long time figuring out who I was as a brown person, and just really like ran away from pieces of my identity for so long. And I was like, well, if brown is bad and everyone's going to say like nasty, horrible shit and just make all these comments from the like very racist to all the microaggressions, and you know how it is. Like if we had a dime for every time
Oh,
somebody's
yeah.
like, "Where are you from?" No,
Yeah.
where are you from? I'm like, from the freaking moon. Anyway, we'd be rich
Yeah.
and we'd be in Hawaii. Not to say we don't love our jobs, but anyway, I it took me a long time to figure out who I wanted to be as a brown woman and what that identity was. And a big piece of that was when I became a parent. My husband is white. We've been together since we were 20 years old, and we have these two children. They're teenagers. And when I became a parent, I was like, wait a minute, there's this part of my identity that I've just really run away from, because of fear and because of trauma and because of
Yeah.
experiencing racial trauma. And I was like, how do I want to raise these multiracial children and give them a sense of an Indian identity? And then, of course, the next question is, well, what is my Indian identity? What does that even
Yes.
mean? What does
Yeah.
it mean to be Desi? And I'm not like, I don't know, I hate to say typical Desi, but I often like fought against a lot of the stereotypes. I was like, I hate math. My mother is a doctor. No, I don't want to be a doctor.
Yeah. Yeah.
Married a white man, was very sort of untraditional. And like the aunties love me, but they're like, oh yes, she is her own person. They'll say things like that, which I'm like, yes, but also that it is also a way of saying like, oh, she's kind of doing her own thing.
Yeah.
Um, and in this unprecedented way, like I remember being in college and seeing the signs for like, they see like a South Asian student, whatever. And I was like, I don't want that. I don't want to be around these people. And then suddenly when I
Mm.
became a parent, I would see these brown, like Desi looking moms at the playground. And I would be like, hi, hi. And I sort of I was like, oh, do you guys do anything for Diwali? Like, what, do you want to do something? Do you want to light some diyas? And I was like, oh, I should learn how to make this halwa that my mom used to make. How did she do that? And so it's just
Yes.
part of this reckoning. Where it ties with the professional piece is like, I have two children. I'm a survivor, two-time survivor of postpartum depression, anxiety, and OCD. So I wrestled really mightily with a perinatal mental health stuff. And I realized that in the mess, when I was like really in the shit with it, I felt so much shame. And a lot of that shame came from this like, gosh, my parents struggled so much that I could have everything.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
I have everything. I have this wonderful husband who loves me so much, these two beautiful, healthy, wonderful children. I have a house. We're not struggling in that way, but I am struggling. And I was like, oh, well, fuck, like something is really wrong with me. And I have done my parents wrong. Like this is I'm really not good enough. They sacrifice, definitely, like I definitely heard that narrative of like, we came here with nothing, so you could have everything. So you should be grateful.
Yes.
And so part of this journey has been figuring out what role did culture and race play into my experience with perinatal mental health. And through a whole bunch of twists and turns, I did public health and I wound up running new parent support groups and doing all this postpartum support work. And I just noticed that the perinatal field was really white. And I would go to
Yes.
conferences and I'd be like, oh, there's like a handful of black and brown faces. We're like, hey, what's up, sis? Like, we
Yeah.
want to be friends.
Yeah.
And so one of the reasons why I ended up going to school was so that I could be a brown therapist. So I could sit with the children of immigrants and be like,
I
yeah,
get
so
it.
yeah, like what did we learn about parenting? Like who
Yeah.
taught us about what it means to be a mother or a good mother? What does it mean to show love? What does it mean to struggle? Like, what is this normalization and glorification of struggle and sacrifice, man?
Yeah.
And so,
And
yeah, that's what I do.
And, while you're speaking, even though I was born in India and like I moved to Canada when I was 10, but I sit in this in between, like, am I Canadian? Am I Indian? Am I, what is my identity? And I totally resonate with the fact that it wasn't until I became a mom that I truly was like, wait a second, I'm here wanting to pass on my culture to my kids, but I need to be more and like, I need to understand my culture first. I need to understand who I am first. And so that was when I started really focusing on celebrating my culture, reconnecting with it again, and in a way that felt good to me. Right. So
Yeah.
I deeply, everything you're saying, I'm like, wow, yes. And I remember being referred to therapy because I had postpartum anxiety after my first. And,
Oh, I'm sorry.
I was just like, so much of the anxiety isn't just the typical mom stuff. It's also the race. It's also the culture. It's also the interracial marriage. There's so many aspects that I feel like are often missed when you're seeing a white therapist who maybe is not trained and not aware that these things even matter. Right. So I'm so grateful that there are people like you in this field. So tell me a little bit about how do race and culture impact parenting?
Oh my gosh. So many ways, right? Like I'm like, okay, buckle up. How much time do we have? I think, one of the things that I think about so much is like, how do we show love? Like, what is the demonstration of love? And I'm sure we've all seen that meme that like they see mom is not going to say, I love you. She's going to say, did you eat?
Exactly. I was like, I'm just thinking love is food, right? Like for my mom, love
Right.
means making food for us, asking if I've eaten.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I do for you. I am like, it is the
The
normalization.
service. Yeah.
It's the glorification of not just service, it's sacrifice.
Yes.
And with this element of suffering, right? Like I don't exist, I do for. Our culture is really relational, right? Like we define ourselves in relation to our
To
families.
others.
Like I'm so and so's daughter, I am a mother, I am a wife, I am a, I don't have siblings, but it's just this like we are in relation to each other. And so much of parenting is figuring out like what do I want to do for my children? How do I want to love them? And how also do I want to preserve myself? And
Mm,
we don't know anything about that, right? And I am always so ready to like rush out of the house, like pick somebody up, make somebody special food, even when I'm tired. And now the kids are older and they call me on it all the time. And they're like, do you want this? We got Chinese takeout the other day, and my older one loves pork and chive dumplings. And he's like, do you want this dumpling? And I was like, no, 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 you have it. And he's like, do you want the dumpling or not? And I'm like, no, I did this. No, you have it, which is like, I look like an auntie, right? I'm
yeah.
like, no,
Yeah.
you have it.
Yeah. It's like, I can just picture my mom saying that. And the funny thing is my brother and I would call my mom out on it too. I remember one year we bought her new shoes for Mother's Day or her birthday or something. They were half size too small. She didn't tell us. She
Oh,
forced her feet. We could have easily just exchanged it, right? Like no
right,
problem. But she was like, oh my gosh, my kids bought me a gift. And we were like adults at this time, right? So it wasn't like we were babies.
right.
And she wouldn't tell us. And I found out months later that she's been forcing her sore feet into these shoes because we bought her these shoes. And so
Oh,
it's
mom.
this type of like sacrifice, not asking for what you want, being okay, not ever being first, that, many of us have absorbed from our moms, right? And the women in our family.
Oh, totally. And like this whole thing of like we eat last, like I'm
Yes.
feeding everybody. It's just like this that I mean, there's big things, which I'll say in a second, but like some of it is just like really basic everyday shit. Like who gets the big piece of chicken? Like I will never
Yes.
take it. I will give it to my kids and my husband. And
Yeah.
it's been a lot of like unlearning and relearning because they're like, wait a minute, do you really want it or not? And they've called me on it now. They're like, we don't know whether you mean it or you don't mean it. And like, that doesn't,
Right.
they almost said like, it doesn't feel good. And I was like,
Yes.
uh-oh. And I was like, look, this is, and I'm a huge fan of like the micro narrating, like why I'm doing what I'm doing. And I'm like, this is how I was raised and it's part of my culture. And I can see how it's not super helpful. So I'm going to try to do better. And now
Mm.
I would like this dumpling. Would you like it? We can have a negotiation about it. Whereas my husband, who is wonderful, of course, he's like, I'll eat the dumpling.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Because they don't think twice about it because it's never. First of all, they're men, and then they're also like white men. So it's not in the culture to put others first, right? Sounds bad, but it's kind of true.
But it's
So
what they
it's like
learned,
it's what they
right?
learn. I remember the same types of conversations. It's like we'd have leftovers, and he'd be like, "Oh, do you still want some?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I want to keep it for my lunch tomorrow," right? Like in my head, but I would be like, "No, no, you eat it," and then there would be no lunch the next day, and I'd be like going to work and not have like it's the simple stuff. So I'm glad you're talking about that because so many people think it's the big things only, but it's all these little behaviors that we learn and then we start to embody ourselves when we become parents.
Well, right. And like the other example, like the day-to-day things, like last year, two children, two different places needed to be picked up at the same time. Some pickup fell through. One child here, one child there, need to be picked up at the same time. And I was like, oh my God. And I'm like frantically being like, can you get my kid? Da, 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 da. My husband's like, okay, well, someone will just wait. They'll just wait for 10 minutes. I'm like, uh, she can't wait. She will have it swim practice and she has wet hair and it's cold, like wet hair Indian mom. Like I'm every
Yeah, yeah,
stereotype
yeah,
now.
yeah. Yeah.
But he was like, just don't turn yourself into a pretzel. Like the child can take a hit here. They're not 6. Like she was like 12 at the time. It's
Yeah.
13, something, it's fine. And I was
Yeah.
like, oh, I'll turn myself into a pretzel so the child isn't waiting in the cold.
Yes.
And it's like, and I think that like we don't know how to protect ourselves in that way. And you know how it is. Like shit is exhausting. And
Mhm.
we don't do ourselves favors. We didn't learn how
Yeah.
to protect
Care for ourselves.
ourselves.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like we're probably not eating all the things that we should. We're like, no, no,
No.
no, you have. Oh, I guess I will. I'll do everything without saying like, no, I can't get you. Either wait until I can, get an Uber, take the bus.
Yeah. Here are the options. Yeah. And I think that it actually doesn't serve our kids in the future because when we do everything for them, they don't learn those skills themselves. And then many of us, we become 18, 19, we go off to college, and then we're like suddenly left to figure it all out because nobody, like people have just been doing it for us the entire time. So it doesn't teach us those skills either. So it's like, obviously it's beneficial for us if we, start seeing what we need, but it's also helpful for our kids. So, it's both. And that example with the food, so many of the clients that I work with, they don't eat fruit. And I was not eating fruit. I save all the good fruit for my kids. All the
Yeah.
berries, all the strawberries. I'm like, I'll eat an apple, banana. You eat the berries, right? And because they love it, right? And they'll eat the whole thing. But it's like, no, no, I deserve fruit. If anyone needs antioxidants, it's the people who are aging, right?
Right. But the point that point is so important of like, how do we show, and this is the thing, like, how do we show the children that we're humans and not
Mm,
robots and we don't
yes.
exist to serve them?
Yeah.
We do in some ways, but it's not like, how do we find this balance? And that I think is like the really tricky thing that I think many people are trying to figure out. And like
Yeah.
along the same lines, we do tend to like fix it, because that's often what was
Yes.
modeled for us. Because
Absolutely.
ain't nobody in a Dacey family talking about feelings. Like,
No, no.
what in the ever loving fuck is that? Like, no. Right. And so, like, I still do this when my kid's like, I need to figure this thing out. Even yesterday, he texted me about some scheduling conflict and mom, and he clearly is like distressed. And so, and the most important part of parenting, right? It's co regulation, is that we
Can't
can't
match their energy when they're stressed. Yeah.
and like do as I say, not as I do. I'm like, girls learning big time here.
I'm
Like,
I'm learning too because it is a practice every day, literally.
every day. And how do
every
we be
day.
like, okay, I see this as, and to like name the feeling like, oh man, I'm sorry. This is so frustrating. I'm sorry. This is so annoying. Like that you have to
Yeah.
deal with this, and not jumped in this like, okay, do this, do that.
I will solve your, yeah.
And I had to be like, okay, I'm like, I was like, grr, emojis like, sorry, blah, like WTF, annoying. And how can I help? Because
Mm.
so much of that's another big piece of culture, right? That like, um, just because our parents often were a product of their own intergenerational trauma.
Yes.
So many people in the diaspora in different generations, war, forced migration, partition,
Yes.
any religious persecution, all kinds of stuff. And nobody's grandparents ever talked about that. And everyone's just like,
Just buried it away. Yeah.
and like you see your parents get distressed and nobody names what's going on. Nobody talks about it. Kids often have to like be like, whoa, what's happening? Nobody's talking about it. And they absorb all of that because nobody's saying like, I got upset because X.
Yeah.
This is what happened for me. When I get upset, it's not your responsibility. I'm going to figure out how to manage my stuff. And no matter what, I love you. I'm always here for you. That never happened.
Yes.
That never happened for us.
Never.
So we have to learn how to do that for our kids.
Yeah.
No models, right?
Which no models. Yeah. And I will say that like that's something that we definitely see in our culture, but I feel like that's cross-cultural in our parents' generation because so for so long I had thought being brown was a problem. Having brown parents was the problem. But now that I'm married to somebody who isn't brown, I'm like, whoa, hold up. There's a lot of problems in white families, in all families. And
Yes.
there's a lot of good in the way I was raised that I'm so grateful for, because if I hadn't learned those things, the culture here, the Canadian culture would not have taught that to me. Because the
Yes.
culture here is, that colonist mentality, me, 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 me. And so there's that balance of like, what is the good from our culture that we can take away? And then what is the stuff that we're like, I want to change this. And that's the hard part I find is it wasn't modeled in any way, right? Like there's no perfect model that we can go off of. We're literally creating the path for ourselves.
Yes. And that is like, I often tell clients, I'm like, don't bushwhack alone. Like that is what I do, like for most of the time, like there isn't a path.
Yes.
And so much of what we're doing is you're exactly like 100%. Like there are some things that are so lovely, like all the duty to family stuff. Sometimes it sucks, but like sometimes it's wonderful.
Absolutely.
And like the connection and, just all of the family stuff is really lovely.
Yeah.
And how do we reflect on what we were raised with and take the pieces and really look at it? And it's like you got a big old like messy ass purse and you have to like dump it all out on the table and be like, okay, what do we have here? What do I want to hold on to? What is this
I love
thing?
that analogy.
But it is, it's like,
Yeah.
it is like, it's the stuff we carry with us. Right. And
Yes.
like,
Yes.
and it's like so many dimensions of like, from like, what do we do with food? Because I don't know, I keep talking about food and I swear it's not just because I'm basic, but we eat all day long.
We
Like
do. Yeah.
you have to interact with food.
Yeah.
There are like various triggers. I always say like parenting is really triggering, right?
It
And
is.
like,
Yeah.
right, like like all like the hornet's nest that's like kind of over here,
Yeah.
like it gets kind of like, and everything comes out. And if anybody has issues with food, like it's gonna happen because we gotta feed the kids all the time.
Yeah. And
Or yeah,
these are things you can't anticipate until you have kids. I had no idea when I was pregnant that I would even, it's like this whole bag was sealed shut.
yes,
And suddenly like the zipper starts like, using that personality, it starts opening and you're like, all this stuff starts coming up and you're like, I didn't know that I was even upset about this. I didn't even know I had trauma from this situation, because nothing's triggering it until it does, until your children are screaming or until something about how they respond reminds you of yourself. And for me, it's been like, oh, when I reacted like that, I had no compassion. I was given no compassion. And now I have to respond with compassion so that my child doesn't grow up feeling the same way I did about
100%.
my big feelings. Right.
Right, right. And like when they hold up the mirror and you're like,
Oh,
oh shit.
yeah.
And like you're tired and you just pushed out a baby, or like you
Yeah.
had major abdominal surgery, or
Yeah. Yeah.
and like the thing that I think is so important to remember when we do this parenting thing is that not only are we realizing like, oh, when I had this behavior or this reaction, I was not met with the compassion that I'm trying to give my child. So not only are you learning how to do the thing and the way was never done for you, but you're also like grieving and mourning a loss of what you should have had and didn't.
Yes. Which is sad because you feel like, wow, what, what did I miss? How much did I miss because I didn't receive what I needed? And it's both. You're so right. It's like this process of like grieving and healing and knowing that, we're doing better for our kids and hopefully moving that cycle forward and breaking some of those patterns that we grew up with, right? But yeah, wow. I have friends who don't have kids and they're like, shouldn't we have kids? Should we not? And I'm like, listen, it is a big responsibility and you have to do what's best for you, but it is hard. It is triggering, but it also brings so much healing and joy in a way that I don't think I would have had if I wasn't a parent. Do you know what I mean?
Totally. 100%. It's like every time, and I say this all the time, I'm like, every time we talk about the hard things and we dump the purse out and like sort through everything and, like, oh, this is really triggering. How do I want to parent differently? Oh, I never
Yeah.
got this. Let me look at this and like process this loss. That is intergenerational healing.
Yes.
That's what that is. And sometimes it happens in like mundane things where the child's like, I don't like this food. And like, I hate bhindi. Like, I cannot eat it. And some people are like, I love it. I'm like, no, and never give it to me again. And like, I know I have, as an adult, I learned I have oral sensory issues because guess what? One of my kids has it. And I learned, he was like, and he could finally say like, this food is really slimy and gross. I
Slimy.
don't like it. And I was like, and if you can say to that child, like, okay, yeah,
That's
sometimes
fine.
food
Yeah.
feels weird in our mouths. Like, it's important you eat vegetables. How would you like your vegetables cooked?
Yeah.
He likes like broccoli, like vegetables, like roasted, like salt and pepper, like garlic powder, like chili
Yeah.
powder,
But
hot,
not the
crunchy,
like
salty.
slimy. Yeah. Yeah. And that's fair. And I think that it's the same thing when I was a kid. I was always thin and small. So I was always told, eat more, eat more. And I'm like, I'm done. Like, I want to respect my body, but like, I didn't have that language, but you're being forced to eat more. So I started hating food. I started resenting food because when we moved to Canada, the principal said, I'm really small. So he's like, I was ahead of grade in India. So he's like, she should stay in her age grade here. So I had to repeat grade 5 because I was really small, apparently. I was still small in grade 6. Trust me. I didn't grow that much. I was just short, And, but I had internalized this message that my body's a problem, which means I need to eat more. But then the food here I hated because I'm used to eating delicious Indian food. And then that
Right.
was made fun of when I went to school. So now I'm eating cheese sandwiches, which is like so boring. And I'm vegetarian. So there's like minimal options for sandwiches. And
Right.
then I started hating food. And so now that I have kids, it's so easy for me. I don't care if they're picky because I remember that trauma and I'm like,
Yes.
it's all good. I have no stress about food, which I know a lot of parents have because of, maybe they didn't have the same experience that I did, but I remember feeling like, fine, I just hate food because I'm being forced all the time to eat it.
Oh,
Oh yeah,
that's
it's awful.
awful.
And I don't think parents realize that when they're forcing their kids, that could happen,
Oh, yeah.
and it wasn't even like eating disorder. Like I want to be thin. It was just like, I don't want food because it's always a problem. It's always, relating back to my body being a problem somehow. And,
Right.
it's hard. It's hard now as a parent because that stuff, I share because I've learned a lesson from how I was parented. And I'm like, I know not to do that to my kids.
Right.
But
Right.
then some things you just react in the same way like my dad reacted. And I'm like, oh, I really did not want to do that. But
Right.
how do I learn the behaviors to not do it? And so tell me about your work because you counsel your clients one-on-one.
Yeah.
What are some strategies people need to work on to help them change those patterns and even be self-aware enough to actually recognize how they feel and what they need?
It's such a good question. And I often, I remind everybody that it's skills, it's work, it's unlearning and relearning, right? And like you would never tell anybody who'd never run before, okay, go run a marathon. Like
Right.
first you do, you're like, I'm going to run for 30 seconds and walk for a minute. I'm going to do that for
Yes.
10 minutes. I'm going to do that 3 times a week. And you build it up. So it's like itty bitty
Oh,
muscles
I
that you
love
got
that.
to learn.
Yeah.
Right? We're learning. It's not like you flip a switch and like, oh, I'm going to do it a whole different way. No, you're like 30 whatever years old. You've been doing shit for like a certain way. It's going to take a minute. But what I think is really powerful is like being able to cultivate this awareness, to be able to tune in to what is happening. Like that example, right? Like if you, with food, if you react a certain way and it just kind of, something happens to our brains and bodies and someone like pushes the button and it's like a trigger wire, it gets tripped and whoop, something comes out, like you react in a certain way. If we can practice being able to observe that and being like, oh, that thing happened, shoot, okay. And to really practice, like when your child does a certain thing or says a certain thing, or even yesterday, this example of the kid being like, Mom, I'm like, distress, I'm getting distressed and so activated. I was like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Oh, I'm getting activated. I notice my distress, and we often externalize the thing like, ooh, distress is showing up. Oh, anxiety is really loud. Like, it's not like, oh, I'm so anxious, but it's happening to me. Like
Yes.
anxiety is appearing.
Yeah.
Oh, that like low mood is like really dragging me down today. Like name it as an external thing and observe it with like that, like reaction. Like it's not going to last a long time. If you can like hold on and be like, whoa, whoa, I see that reactivity. That's like really loud and it's vibrating in my body. What am I going to do to just take a breath, take a beat, observe it, notice it? And I'm not going to react from that place. Like the reaction's okay. We're not going to judge it. It's here, it's showing up for a reason.
Yeah.
Fine. And hold on a second, take some breaths and be like, oh, hold on a second. We're not going to react from that place of distress. Let's wait a minute. And like, we're okay. What do we want to do? Okay. Yeah, I see you're really frustrated. That sucks, man. What can I do to help? And it's like the slow training of like, yeah, I see that happening and I'm not going to respond from that place. And if you do get mad or you do like, you should be thankful for your food, whatever thing you say, the most wonderful thing about parenting is that it's an ongoing thing and it's based on rupture and repair, right? If you mess it up or you don't do it right, guess what? You're a human and not a fucking robot. Fine. Be like, hey, you know what? The thing that I said the other day or at lunchtime or whatever, like, I reacted kind of badly and I want to try that again. Or like, just, you can say, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have spoken that way to you. Or my reaction was wrong. I'm going to try to do it differently. Name the thing for the kids because that was never done.
Yes. And guess what? I've started doing that. And my kid, my older one, will call it out now. She's like, you need to apologize because you yelled. And I'm like, yes, you're right. And it's really lovely because she recognizes that she doesn't deserve to be yelled at. And we tell her that we don't want to yell, but sometimes it does happen. And then you're like, you feel awful about it, but that repair literally never happened in my entire life for my parents. Nope. So the fact that I can do that for my kids, that we can, do that for our kids, I think is beautiful. And it also teaches them that like what kind of behavior they deserve, right? From their friends, from their teachers, from their peers. Because we learned, internalized that if people of authority yell at us, that we deserve to be yelled at, right?
That we are bad,
that we're bad.
Wrong. Right.
Exactly.
Right. And the other piece of that I think, and we talk about this so much with clients, is that like so much of it is like just like bits of psycho ed, right? Of like, this is what attachment is. And like that this is part of the co-regulation of like, hey, I'm sorry. And that like whatever like stuff the kid's holding, they can let go of it. Or like, you're like, give me those hard feelings. Don't hold them alone. Like that wasn't your fault. I lost my temper. And you're showing them how to have feelings. They're learning that their mom sometimes gets mad, sometimes yells, and then apologizes.
Yes.
And that she loves them no matter what. And she makes mistakes and she's going to keep trying.
Yes. And I think it sounds easy, but it's actually such hard work. And it's for anybody who's like started their journey in therapy or has not even considered it. Like for me, therapy has been so important because without that, I don't think I would have the tools like you described to run a marathon, right?
Yeah.
The building blocks, because this literally was not taught to us ever, never modeled.
It's a marathon.
It is. And it's an ultra marathon. So, you have to learn those skills. And I think that's what your work, what you help people develop is those skills to unlearn and then examine themselves. How do they feel? And then respond from a place of calm instead of like reacting all the time, which I can now see in other parents when they're dysregulated or,
Yeah.
you know, elevated. And the fact that I can actually recognize that now is huge. Cause before I was so like blind to all those feelings, I would not even be able to pinpoint it. Right.
Right. Right.
And so
Yes.
tell me, so we've talked about, how race and culture impact parenting and the triggering that can happen. Can you talk about your kids are older? So they're kind of preteens or teens?
They're teens.
They're
Yeah.
teens.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. I know. It's
Wild.
wild. It's
Yeah.
wild.
Yeah.
And so you've kind of been through the infant toddler phase, the preschool, kind of elementary. Can you share some of the themes, I guess, in parenting, like the common struggles that come up when you're parenting kids? For me, I'm thinking right off the bat, like handling their big emotions is one, right? And yeah, what are some other, like, I wouldn't know. I don't have older kids, so I have no idea what's in store for me.
It's like, well, I mean, it's so much of it is like handling your own shit and like handling your own triggers, like when they hold up the mirror. Like when your kid gets teased in middle school, how do you respond to that
Mm,
child that is not like, that's not just a manifestation of your own trauma. Like so much of it is like managing like the activation of our own trauma and our own triggers. Like that's like 99% of parenting, I feel like. But it's like handling the big emotions, which toddlers, it's like a great preview for teens because it's the same thing, like small person, like huge emotions like that. And like teens, it's like a whole, like the moods and the stuff. I'm like, woo. And I come back to the same thing that we see to the toddlers. Like when the 2-year-old is mad and hitting you, you're like, oh, you can be mad. That's okay. You can't hit me. I will not let you hit. You can like, oh, you can throw the ball, but you can't throw it in the house. Like you validate the feelings, you correct the behavior.
right.
It's the same thing with teens. I'm like, you can feel whatever way you want, but you cannot be an asshole. Like that is not
Yeah.
okay. You cannot weaponize your shit onto me and your sibling like that. If you're in a bad mood, tell us you're in a bad mood. Tell us you need space. That's fine. It's so much of the like, and remembering that when kids behave in a certain way, they have an unmet need. Because they're
Yes.
humans, just like us. Like I'm nasty and cranky when I am hungry, when I am
Hungry. I was
tired,
just, yeah, hungry, sleepy. Yeah. Yeah.
overstimulated, like when I don't have a
Yes.
break. And
Yes.
so much of it is interpreting, like, noticing that you're doing X and Y. That's okay. Do you have a need? Do you need a break? Do you need a snack? And they're like, I'm fine. I'm like, well, if you're fine, then you need to be fine.
Oh, that's good. Yeah.
I'm like, don't, I will not do this. The words and tone and body have to match. I'm fine. I'm like, okay, well then you need to change your behavior. If you're not fine, then we can deal with it.
Deal with the need. Yeah.
So much of it is interpreting like the emotions, dealing with the emotions, our own distress tolerance, being able to co-regulate, manage our own trauma. And the other thing that I think is huge, a big challenge of parenting, like from throughout the stages, is being able to understand when to let your child lead and when to kind of give them a little nudge.
Yeah.
Um, that I think is such a challenge of parenting. Like, when are you going to wean the baby? When is the baby going to learn to use the toilet? When is the
Yeah.
baby going to separate in a certain way? When are you going to be like, I know that you don't want to do this activity, but like, you can't just stay home all summer and like lie around like a sloth on your phone. Like, you're going to have to do something. Which one do
Mm,
you want to do? This, or this?
yeah.
And I again, to bring it back to race and culture, I think, for many of us, we were just never given choices. It was like, you will do this now.
Yeah. It's like
And
it's like, it's one of two things. Like the way I've, in my experience, it's like, you're either babied when you're old, like even when you're a teenager and you're like, or in university, you're like treated like like a baby, right? Child, like you can't do anything on your own. You need your parents to do everything for you, or you're being told this is what you're doing now.
yes,
And so you're like, I don't get choice and I don't get trust. I feel like nobody trusts me to do these things. And you can be the smartest kid in the school, all rounder. Like, they see kids are trying to prove themselves all the time, trying to earn the parents' pride. But the reality is, what I'm recognizing is my parents don't have the skills themselves to recognize those things because they weren't taught and they didn't have the practice and they didn't have the support, the mental health support and the training and the tools. So I'm expecting things from them that they just cannot offer. And
Right.
so as a parent now, I get to choose those things from, my kids as I raise them.
Right. And then there's the bushwhacking of like, okay, how do I do this? How do I figure this out? Like,
Yeah.
I was raised with this thing, but this just isn't working for me and my kid. But what are these other models? And, I live in this very like precious snowflake kind of neighborhood where everybody's like crunchy and earthy. And we just let the children lead because they're magical. I'm like, I got to go to work, step on the gas. I'm like, sometimes there's hard to find.
You need that balance because you can't just be like, all right, we're just, yeah. Cause I feel like kids also need to know that they have an adult who they can trust and they're not like trying to
Oh,
lead the
yeah.
way and they're like 3, right?
No, you need boundaries and structure. And no, like there's definitely like, I definitely see people, I'm like, oh no, like you need to tell them no, like it's okay. And they're like, well, I don't want to hurt their feelings. I'm like, no, 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 that's part of parenting. You can tell them no. And like, again, like they might not like it and it might not feel good for you. And this is like the both and parenting is so much
Yes.
both and, right?
Yeah.
Like, and it can be hard and also right. And like
Oh yeah.
our parents, they did the best they could. We can be grateful for all of what they did and also be sad at what we didn't get. Like that is a lot of what we do in therapy, holding the both and.
Both truths and understanding to kind of accept where we are now, right?
Yes.
It's so interesting because for me, that's been a lot of my journey over the past 5 years. And I will say for anyone listening, like it makes a difference because I am a totally different parent than I was a year ago.
Yeah.
And I know that each year that passes, hopefully, knock on wood, I will be a better parent, know my kids better, know myself better.
Mhm.
And there's like that wisdom that comes as you get older too. You start recognizing like, anyways, it's easier to recognize what matters, what
Yes.
is a priority, and what is just like, this is not important. No point stressing about it. Like a
Right.
clean home, I would love to have that every day, but that's just not realistic for the point of parenting we're at. And we have a toddler who literally will take things apart the second we put it back together. So we just have to recognize that this is where it is. That's why I'm laughing when you said this is a preview of teenagers. And I'm just like, ooh, this kid as a teen, I'm excited for that because it'll be interesting.
Oh yeah. I mean, it's just, and it's amazing to watch them become themselves, right? And that's a beautiful thing to sort of like open the door and be like, yes, you're interested in this thing. Great, go do it. Go be who you are. And that like, I think my husband is really, really good at like a good counterweight. I think that's been really helpful for me in my parenting journey. And I often say this, many of my clients are newly postpartum and often they complain about their partner being like, oh, my partner doesn't do it right and they're not doing it right. And I'm kind of like, they're doing it differently. It's not necessarily wrong.
Right
It's
or
great
wrong.
for
Yeah.
kids to have different models of
Yes.
how to approach different situations, how to problem solve. There's no one right way to do things.
It's true. And I feel like we have to recognize that we each, like, I have many weaknesses, but I also have many strengths, and like build off your strengths and teach your kids from that. Right. And yeah, I see that. Or people are trying to figure it all out when their babies are like 6 months. I'm like, this is just the beginning. Like, give yourself time. I think you're always going to be figuring it out. I talked to my mom, right? Like, obviously her kids are like grown-ups and she's still saying, I still learn stuff all the time, and because now she's like done her parenting journey in the sense that like we're grown up and out of her
Right.
house and
You're
whatnot. So
launched.
she can now reflect back, and she has that ability now because she's not working 2 jobs and like exhausted and, in the thick of it, she can now reflect back and say, oh yeah, I wish I did do things differently at this time, which is really healing for me because we were able to have this type of adult conversation. And I can't do that with my dad. And I recognize that people have their different capacities to handle these types of conversations. So it's really wild when we're right in the thick of it.
Yes.
And so I want to talk about, we talked about some of the cultural narratives, and can you talk about, there's something, oh yes. You talked about your mom's food, how people used to make fun of your mom's food and how your house smelled. And I am like, yep, I was so embarrassed. I would not invite friends over. And everyone's like, I've
Yeah.
heard Indian food's great. And I'm like, I'm too embarrassed to have you over because you're going to make fun of my food smell, because you'd make fun of my clothes, make fun of all this stuff. So I learned very early on when I moved here to be embarrassed about my culture.
Oh, yeah.
And you grew up here or, in the US. So how was that?
Oh, God. Yeah. It's so wild. The punchline of the story is that my very white husband like makes more Indian food than I do and makes dosa from scratch. And like,
Not same as
like
my husband. Same. Literally, he's a better Indian than I am.
total. And like my parents still say that. But my dad will be like, he's Indian. You're not really Indian. I'm like, okay. And of course my husband will eat bhindi and eat baigan and eat all the things. I'm like, I don't like that. And my husband's like, I'll eat anything. Like, give me a char, give me everything, whatever. It's fine.
Yeah.
But no, when I was growing, I grew up in Connecticut, and I did have friends who would come over, and like nearly all of them would say, what is that smell? And my mom was obsessed with closing up the kitchen. Like it would be almost like hermetically sealed with like all of the fans. And whenever we would come in and out, she'd be like, close the door, we're cooking. You can't have the house smell. My mother was a doctor, and she was like, I cannot go to the hospital smelling like food because people will look at you. I can't smell like this food. And it was so everyone's ew, ew, ew. And I was always allowed to have Stouffer's frozen French bread pizzas or Kraft mac and cheese in the blue box when my friends came over. And that when I would have a sleepover. So we would sit at the table and my parents would eat with their hands. I'd be like, I hope it's okay that we eat with our hands. And, like, excuse me, like, I'm sorry if you think this is gross. This is how we eat. And we would get our French bread pizza or we would get our Kraft mac and cheese. And I remember when I was in high school, I had a friend, I went to boarding school actually, so I wasn't home all the time. And I had a friend come and visit me over a vacation. And I remember we were same deal sitting at the kitchen table, and my mom had some dal and she had sambar and she had some chicken curry.
Delicious.
We grew up
Yeah.
eating meat. Yeah. And my friend, like, when I was a kid, it was like, ew, what is that? And like, then this high school friend was like, what is that? And my mom was like, this is dal.
Her eyes light up.
Lentils with spinach. Would you like some? It's very nice if you put some yogurt on it. Come get the yogurt, give it to them. And they were like, oh, it's really good. And like from there on, it was a completely different experience. And I'd have college friends come over. Somebody was like high in the middle of the night. They're like opening the kitchen. They're eating the Indian food cold from the Corningware dish. And my mother would be like, you have to heat it up. You can't eat it cold. And they'd be like, this is really good. And it's just amazing how now everyone's like, oh, golden milk. And I'm like, it's healthy. Like,
dude. I know.
Healthy.
It's like,
it's like this stuff that is so, we always had like ghee in the little, that little stainless
steel jar thing, or,
thing
thing with the lid and the spoon. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm like, I can't describe it. I can see it in my mind, like exactly how it was. And just like the things that we grew up with that people thought were disgusting. Now, that it's
cool. It's trendy. Yeah.
It's expensive. And
it's
really, and I'm like, bone broth. And I'm like, yeah, my mom used to go and like get like beef bones from the butcher when somebody was sick, and she would make broth from the bones because she was like, there's bone marrow nutrients in here. It's really good for you. And everyone's like, oh yes, I'm having my bone broth and my golden milk. I'm like, and it's just frustrating. I'm like, great, that's fine. And sometimes I'll complain about it. And sometimes the older generation is like, oh, look at this. Everybody's doing yoga. It's so good. I'm like, yeah, all right, fine. But like and they're like, oh, look at our culture. It's becoming more mainstream. People are appreciating it. And yes, I get that. That's lovely. And also
it's just, we're being erased from it, right? So when people drink turmeric milk, they don't even recognize that it's Indian, right? So I remember I was at my old work when I worked in a clinic and I was sick or like getting over a cold, and my boss was like, oh, you should go down to the Aroma. They have a turmeric latte that's really good for you. It's turmeric I'm like, excuse me. You do not have to tell me about the benefits of and of course they say turmeric, like it's a tumor. I'm like, there's an R, it's turmeric. Like even that used to piss me off. And it's like, it's great that they're doing yoga. It's great that they're drinking, doing the Ayurvedic benefits of all the foods and everything, but we are being erased from those those things. And that's the problem,
That's the
right?
problem. When some white lady's telling me how to pronounce something, in some asana, and I'm like, just, I can't be here.
I can't be there. No.
I cannot do yoga with white people anymore ever again.
Yeah.
Yes, this is going to go on the internet. Somebody's going to say some nasty shit to me, but I'm just so done because
No, I had somebody actually on talking about who she teaches yoga, and she's of Indian background from the States. And she said the same thing is, white women don't understand how harmful it is when they teach yoga because they're so unaware of the harm that they're causing.
right.
And I always say to my white friends, I'm like, you can learn, you can practice, but why are you teaching? You do not have the skills to teach, even after taking a 200, 300-hour course. This takes years of being steeped in the culture to learn. I always give the example of like, you can bounce a basketball, but that doesn't mean you're playing basketball, right?
No.
It's like you're practicing a part of it. And I feel like that story of, in high school, your friends started to be interested in your food. That happened to me probably in university. In high school, I still was kind of like, not having friends over
Yeah.
and stuff. But then suddenly Indian food was cool. And my white friends would be like, Surabhi, how come you never, invited us to your place? And I'm like, how come you never asked also, right?
Yeah.
You knew you had an Indian friend, but you didn't care to try Indian food, right? It goes both ways. And to anybody who's listening, who's still in that, because a lot of my followers are in that journey as well, where they're rediscovering their culture.
Yes.
And there's nothing as healing as just eating your food openly, eating with your hands, if that's what you want to do. And just like teaching our kids that that's normal.
Right. How you break a piece of the roti off. You don't make the burrito. You like break the
Oh my
piece and you
gosh.
scoop.
Yeah.
And, and like, yes, you have to put your dahi in like with your food a little bit. And like, you have to, it's just
It's culture.
it's absolutely healing to like, imagine like breaking the piece of the chapati and ooh, I just stuck myself in the face and like doing this and like eating your food, that's like, that's home. Right.
And my kids do it, right? They've learned
Yes.
it and they do it. And it's just like so beautiful to see. And I think that's all the magic of our culture that I think that we forget, that I forgot about because I was so focused on all the bad things about my culture that I hated learning from my parents, like the yelling as soon as I do something, make a mistake, the
Yeah.
perfectionism. And a lot of
Yes.
that pressure from them is just because, that's also that colonial mindset. You have to perform to stand out, to get your opportunities otherwise, right? If you don't do well in school, then what? They
Right.
come from a highly competitive country because there's so many people and they have to compete for a few spots at this university or this college or this school or this job. So as I'm getting older, I really empathize with them more. And
Absolutely.
it's that both and I empathize with them and I'm like, but I wish I didn't have that. I grieve the younger version of me that didn't have
Right.
that empathy myself. So I love that you're talking about all this. And I had to laugh because, so for those of you listening, I had Divya fill out this little form, just her bio and her, thing. And she talked about how people buy artisanal ghee for $20. And I literally died laughing because it's true.
And we just had it in like a big thing. And this is like back in, I'm 46. And so back in the 80s, there wasn't a Patel Brothers in the town where I grew up in. And we used to buy the Indian groceries in Jackson Heights in Queens. We used to go to the Ganesh temple, go to Dosa Hut, with 2 T's next door. And then we'd go to the Indian stores in Jackson Heights. And so we'd have the big thing of ghee and you'd have that, like, it was a big thing when the store started selling, how do you say it in English? Cilantro. Like now I'm like in with you and I'm like thinking, oh, not the English word. And my mother's like, oh, Pathmark is selling Guthemir. And I was like, okay, that's great. But it was such a big deal
Yes.
to us then. And now it's just sort of everywhere.
Commonplace. Yeah. When you live in a city, especially, right? You just don't even think twice. And
No.
I always like to remind people, like for me, food is important and like the history of the food. Even non-Indian food, right? I want to understand where this food is from and what, and I think that connects you to the people too and gives you better understanding of them. And I really think that like the amount of patience my mom has to cook those meals, because Indian food takes time to cook. It's not a quick thing. I'm not a good cook.
I grew up like, having to chop the vegetables and like cut the beans and and my mom died nearly exactly 2 years ago. And so much of and like the piece of raising multiracial kids too is that like when people die, stuff it's gone, you know.
Yes.
And I do like I definitely like my mother used to always say like you better learn how to do this, so one day I'm going to be dead and gone, and who's going to do this? And now I'm like, fuck.
You're like, she was right, damn it.
The lady was right about so many things, but like, you know, and she has this like book where she wrote all the recipes. It's like cut onions, and I'd be like, how many onions? She's like, you need to know how many onions you put onions. But she was always like, it's labor intensive to cut. You have to watch. You can't just put it in the oven and walk away. And it's true.
Yeah, it is true. And that's something that I told myself, I'm like, I'm going to learn like one of her recipes every month.
Yeah. Do it.
As I say that, I'm like, I need to start because you're right. Not she writes down her recipes for me too, but it's never right. Like she's like 1 teaspoon. I'm like, what do you mean by teaspoon? Because I'm taking out the measuring device, and for her, it's the spoon that she has. Right.
My mother's was green and stained with haldi, of course. As was everything.
As was everything. Okay, so tell me. I have a few questions for you.
Yes.
Tell me about a book, podcast that you love listening to, that you read, that has changed your perspective or that you love.
The book, I think my first experience with the like, holy shit, my mind was blown by a book was actually reading The Namesake a million years ago. I read that on my honeymoon in 2004. And it really spoke to my experience as a child of immigrants in relationships with white people and navigating the two worlds of like not knowing that you don't put cheese on fish, or not knowing like the certain ways that white people do things or Americans do things, and how like my family was just always going to operate differently. And if somebody gave my parents like a jar of random jams, they would definitely sit in the corner of the pantry forever and nobody would ever use them. That book I found to be just for the first time, somebody kind of mirrored my experience.
Your stories. Yeah.
And you should read Cal Penn's autobiography, because he talks about when he read that book and how he was like, oh my gosh, if this is a movie, like I really want to be in this movie. And it's really cool reading his perception of that story.
Yeah.
I recommend it.
Oh, I haven't read either, so I will put those on my list. Amazing. And do you listen to podcasts?
I often joke that I am a moderately podcast illiterate person, and I listen to the podcasts that my clients send me, because often they're like, I'm listening to this podcast, you have to listen to it. I'm like, okay. I recently, a client sent me the link to Truth Be Told, a bunch of episodes about using psychedelics, like microdosing of psychedelics, to heal racial trauma.
I've heard of this more. Yes.
I was riveted, and I had mentioned to you earlier, I recently had COVID, and I was like slowly starting to like take walks again. And I was listening to these podcasts, and I was like, wow, this is really interesting. Just Black people growing up, just experiencing terrible racial trauma and all sorts of trauma, and just really holding it in their bodies, like just holding it. And
intergenerational trauma that just lives in your body. Yeah.
Hands down. And then like being able to like cry and release through the use of psychedelics. And it was really interesting. And I would like to learn more.
I would like to learn more about that too. I've just recently heard about it. I was listening to Gabor Mate's podcast about his new book, The Myth of Normal. And he was talking about, he has this, and one of my friends was like, I want to go on this. He has a retreat where it's like therapy and microdosing and like this experience essentially that is like, I was like, that sounds interesting, but I feel like there could be more news about that in the future. Tell me about 3 things you do for yourself every day, for whether you call it self-care or just for yourself. What are some small habits that you partake in?
This is such a good question. One of them is that I need to move my body. I have to move my body. Speaking of all the regulation, like girlfriend has to move. So I do something every day, whether it's some sort of walking or cardio, or I love strength training, because I'm like,
amazing. Yes.
Pick things up and put them down. I like lifting heavy things. So that is one thing. Another thing is that I am lucky enough that I often have this little chunk of time. Sometimes it's 15 minutes, sometimes it's longer, between when the children leave the house and when I have to start working.
Yes.
And so I will sit and have my coffee then, and I have really pretty coffee mugs that I've bought at local craft fairs. I'm a stereotype of myself. That's totally cool, fine. But there's these beautiful ceramic coffee mugs, and I sit and I have this delicious coffee that I make at home. and is like this wonderful treat. And I give myself life every day again in this coffee mug.
Well, and it's also that transition, right? Like
Yes.
instead of going kids work, like go, 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 you're giving yourself that pause to like reorient, round yourself. And I love that. You know what? I'm going to steal that idea. I don't
Take
drink
it.
coffee that much, but like I do chai or even just like having a hot beverage of any kind. I think that's a beautiful way to start the day.
And
And
the
15 minutes is doable. It's not like,
15
oh, you
minutes
need
is
3
doable.
hours, right?
No,
You
no,
just
no,
need
no.
you need a pause. Yeah.
Something is, and even with exercise, right? Like, and you know this as like,
Yeah.
as a therapist, like something is better than nothing. Like you can
Yes.
walk for 10 minutes. Great. That's as
That's
opposed to
enough.
sitting in your, yeah.
Yeah.
And the third thing is I love spelling bee, the New York Times spelling bee game. It makes me very happy. And often I sit with my coffee and I do spelling bee. It is so much better than Wordle. Word nerds out there, spelling bee better than Wordle.
I don't know what spelling bee is.
Oh, okay. It is in the New York Times, there's a game section with a crossword and whatever. And it's a game where every day they give you 7 letters, including, and you have to make words out of these 7 letters, and you have to use the one letter that's in the middle of this sort of like, it looks like a honeycomb kind of thing,
Okay.
like spelling
Gotcha.
bee.
Gotcha.
And so you try to make as many words as possible. And it's this like meditative thing that I can come back to in between clients, or if I'm like, waiting, like cooking dinner, I'll like have the computer open and you try to find the pangram, which is the word that uses all the letters. And it just makes me happy.
And it's also good for your brain, right?
Yes. And paired with coffee, it's a nice way to start the day.
Amazing. Okay. So tell me something that you are really passionate about right now.
I've like this whole time I've been talking about stuff that I'm just like, I'm so jazzed about all this. Something that, so right now I'm actually reading the book, The Trauma of Caste. I don't know if you've heard of
I've
it.
heard of the book, but I haven't read it.
I highly recommend this book, and it has really opened my eyes to caste apartheid and Dalit rights, and doing what we can to dismantle caste, to abolish it. The woman who writes the book, she's a Dalit feminist activist, Thenmuri Sundararajan, I believe is her last name. And it is absolutely profound and just mind and sort of body opening. And if anybody's listening to this, please go read this book, because she does such a beautiful job linking Dalit rights to the Black Lives Matter movement, to the Me Too feminist movement, and just connecting disenfranchised, marginalized folks from different
because there's so
diasporas.
many common threads, and it's the same systems, right? The same systems are causing these traumas and victim, like basically, even for myself growing up in India, there's so much we didn't learn, right? We learned about a bunch of world history, but then conveniently we didn't learn about how we also are part of the oppressive system when it comes to caste, or when it comes to
it's still happening. It's not just something that happened a long time ago. I was raised of like, caste is stupid. Like, why do people care about this?
Well, I didn't know caste still existed. And then I'm finding out what, right? But we're sheltered from the truth. And that reminds me of how sometimes white people have no idea that racism exists because they're sheltered. Yeah. Because they don't think they're part of the problem. And it's the same with caste, right? So we can all do something about it. So I love that. Thank you for recommending that book.
Absolutely.
Tell me, if you could change one thing about the world, what would you change?
Violence. I mean, there's just so much violence. Look at we're all this product of intergenerational trauma. When I read that question, when you sent it to me ahead of time, I'm like, I mean, also literally the earth is fucking burning. But really, to me, it's violence. Violence against each other, against the planet, against ourselves. Can we please get rid of it?
Yeah, I 100% agree. And then what would you say is your biggest mom strength?
I love this question. I am just very authentically myself, and I try to be honest with clients, with my children, with people in my life. I'm like, can we just say the hard things and talk about what's really going on? Because I think when we do that, we break down stigma, we let go of shame. Like, shame exists because shit lies in silence, like in our bodies. And if we can just be like, hey, this is something that's hard for me, can we talk about it? That's how we heal. So I think that I am able to talk about things, and I want to talk about the hard things, and I want to hear. And create relationships that are based on authenticity and honesty. I think
Yeah.
that's my
And
mom's
I
strength.
value that too, because it's like the deep, authentic, honest conversations are what bring people closer, right? And help you see the other person versus like the superficial stuff. I love it. And tell me about how people can connect with you online, or whatever ways best to connect with you, and what services you offer.
Oh, that's a good question. So I primarily use Instagram for connecting with people. I am at both Brown and Therapist, because all of both and what
Oh, I
service?
love it. I
Yeah, you
just got it. I
see what
just
I did
got it.
there? See what I did there? Yeah. And what so I am a psychotherapist licensed in the state of Massachusetts. I do individual therapy. So if you are somebody who lives in Massachusetts, I can see you for individual therapy. And the other thing that and I've also run perinatal support groups for folks of color. I love running those spaces. I'm hopefully going to run one in the fall. And the other thing that's like coming down the pipes for me is I'm working on this workbook with all the stuff that I've kind of talked about here. Like, how do we dump out the purse? It's basically like a guidebook of how do you dump out the purse and like sort through your shit.
I
So
love
that
that. And
we
I
kind of,
really thank you for sharing that analogy. I think I'm a very visual person. So I'm like, I'm just going to picture that purse and be like, oh, just dumped it out. And now I have to pick what to put back in, what to discard. And I love it. I love it.
yeah.
Thank you so much, Divya, for sharing your experience, your energy, and your time and your authenticity with me and whoever's listening. Thank you for listening. I think that mental health is something that I wish support was given for everyone in the world, because I think that that's how people can heal, is by better understanding themselves and giving themselves compassion, and then extending that same compassion to everyone else. So thank you for doing the work that you do. I will recommend all of my audience and clients and people to go follow you, to connect with you if you live in Massachusetts. I don't know if I mispronounced that. I feel like how do you
No, you're good. Massachusetts. Yeah.
okay. Go connect with Divya there if you live there, because that would be amazing. And I will be eagerly waiting your workbook.
It's coming. Got to work on it. Yeah.
I know things take more time, right? You think it's going to be quick, and it also just takes time to develop these things. So
that's all right. Yeah.
it's okay. It will happen when it happens. So thank you everyone for listening, and thank you, Divya, for your time. And until next time, have a wonderful day.
Thanks for having me.